guys, welcome back to another video. I hope that you all had a good Christmas, and I'm personally wishing you all a great 2022. If you are enjoying the content, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. If you could give the video a share on social media, that would also be much appreciated. So in today's video we will be taking a look at a list of potential suspects in the Essex boys case. 12 in total, who I believe had the most potential to be the culprits. Now, Michael Steele and Jack Williams are two people who are on this list. If you don't know, these are the two men who were convicted back in '98 and have both been in prison since up until last year, when Jack Williams, the youngest of the two, was released following exemplary behaviour in prison. So they are on the list as potential suspects, even though they were convicted of the crime, because unlike if this was a completely cut and shut case where the evidence was plain as day, the case was a shambles, to say the very least. And yes, Essex police are also on the list. Now, to start off with, first on the list we have Michael Steele, aka Mickey Steele, aka Mickey the Pilot. Now, I will just add, before we move on any further, that the order in which the suspects are placed on this list is entirely random, other than the fact that I started with the two men who were convicted of the crime. The list does not represent the order in which one suspect has, let's say, higher motives than the other. I believe that all the individuals on the list have equal potential to be murder suspects, and I just wanted to sort of make that clear. So, Michael Steele, what motives did he or could he have had? Let's take a look. Now, to begin with, revenge. More specifically, revenge on Pat Tate for threats to Mickey Steele's life. Now, if you're familiar with the case, you will know that Mickey the Pilot was an international drug smuggler who had previously been sentenced to 9 years, I think it was, for pleading guilty to a drug smuggling charge. Now, Mickey had, prior to the murders, imported a consignment of cannabis resin, a consignment which Pat Tate had invested money which he had borrowed from other criminals, and actually promised a higher percentage back in return. Now, this particular consignment ended up being of very poor quality and ended up having to be returned to the original supplier in Holland. Now, this whole situation made Pat Tate furious, and even though Mickey gave him a full refund, Pat continued to tell the original investors that Mickey had not paid him back, and his exact words were, "I will get him to kneel down in front of you and explain himself, and when you're satisfied I will blow his head off in front of you." Now, we know that Sarah Saunders being Pat Tate's common law wife, was very close to Mickey, and she ended up meeting up with him and telling him of Pat's threats. And this in itself, in my eyes, is a huge potential motive. The threat of your life. That's, a bigger motive as there could be. Next, control of the drug distribution. We know that Mickey Steele was not only involved in the smuggling of cannabis into the country, but also profited vastly from its wholesale once it had returned to Essex. And control of the drug distribution could well have been another material motive. Now, as mentioned, Sarah Saunders and Mickey Steele, were apparently very close. Hence the reason Sarah warned Mick about the threats from Pat. And the motive could have been purely out of passion. The potential love for Sarah Saunders. People are murdered all over the world in acts of love or passion. So this possibility, it can't be ruled out. Now, we know that Michael Steele was an international drug smuggler, and I'm sure it's more than possible that Mick was involved in, or involved with crime syndicates and crime cartels, and could very well have been hired or even forced to either carry out the triple murders or simply to lure the three to Workhouse Lane on December the 6th. Now, the evidence, and potential evidence against Steele far from proves his guilt, But as we know, it was Darren Nicholls' testimony which persuaded the jury to convict him. But I'll mention it anyway, the evidence against Michael Steele. First, mobile phone evidence. Now, mobile phone data retrieval was completely different back in the 90s, and only certain information was actually obtainable. But the cell site's data, which helped to convict Mickey Steele, showed that he was potentially in the area when using his mobile phone on the evening of the 6th of December. Next, although it was proven not to be the weapon which fired the cartridges on the night of the killings, it certainly did not look fantastic for his defence in court, the fact that there was a shotgun found at his property. Now, like I mentioned, it was the testimony of Nicholls which convicted Mick and Jack, and in fairness to the two men, there was no damning evidence whatsoever to prove their guilt. No fingerprints, no DNA. If anything, there was evidence to support their innocence. Lack of footprints, evidence of only one firearm being discharged, but nearly 30 years later, Mick still remains behind bars. Now, moving on to suspect number 2, Jack Womes. Now, Jack was the second man to be convicted of the triple murders, and I have a similar list of motives and potential evidence. Now, the first motive is the potential that Mickey Steele, fearing for his life, lied to Jack and told him that both men were in danger of being shot by Pat Tate. So what I'm saying is Mickey could have said to Jack, Pat's threatening to kill us both, we've got to do something about this, which could have, encouraged Jack to participate. And this could easily have been a real worry to Jack if he believed Mick, and had been the reason that he participated in the killings that night. Secondly, as with Mick, the control of drug distribution. We know that Mick and Jack were partners when it came to drug dealing, so the motives to get rid of the three could have been, equal. Moving on to evidence against Jack, or lack of, should I say, starting with the mobile phone data. Now, we know that during the trial, a man by the name of David Bristow, who was a mobile phone expert back in the 90s, with a history of being a witness in favour of the prosecution, actually defended Jack, saying that he could not have been down Workhouse Lane whilst making the phone calls which Nicholls claims that he made to say, come and collect us, come and pick us up. Now, that's a big thing. This guy, like I said, he was a key prosecution witness in his day-to-day court dealings. He wasn't somebody who went on worked for the defence, but in this case he did, and he was adamant that Jack was actually making these calls from a nearby pub where Jack claims he was collecting a broken down vehicle that Nicholls wanted him to collect. Now, we do also know that Jack had got rid of the alleged getaway vehicle the following day, and did actually say to the buyer, make sure that this car just can't be linked back to me, which is potential evidence. Now, we also know in court that Jack admitted shooting his father's shotgun, which shows he had experience in handling shotguns, which in fairness, I guess, could potentially be used as evidence against him. Next potential suspect is Darren Nicholls. Now, Nicholls is dodgy as fuck and a self-confessed liar who alone gave testimony which convicted Mick and Jack, and who was rehoused and relocated with a new life via the Witness Relocation Programme. Excuse me. Now, we know that Darren Nicholls was a registered police informer involved in criminal activities with police officers, and even hatched a plan to steal Mickey Steele's car whilst it contained drugs or drug money. We know that he was given very special privileges whilst in custody, and also allowed to profit from his testimony by selling his story in a book deal. So that's what I mean when I say dodgy as fuck. Anyway, let's take a look at some potential motives. Now, starting with bullying. We know that Darren Nicholls went to visit Pat Tate in hospital when Pat was shot by Nipper Ellis. And apparently on this hospital visit, Nicholls was ridiculed and bullied by Pat, with Pat even offering Darren to go outside and fight one of his friends. Now, a second motive could well be the theft of drugs. We know that an empty sports bag was found in the Range Rover, and this could well have contained drugs, which Darren and his pig associates may have, wanted to steal. Or they could have stolen. Another motive could be to take more control of the drug distribution within Essex. With the three being dead, Pat, Tony and Craig, this would have given Darren more room to distribute cannabis resin and whatever drugs he could get his hands on. Finally, he may have been encouraged by the bent police officers that he was involved with to carry out the shootings, or to assist in some way, whether that be to drive the shooter or shooters to the lane, or to entice the three to their deaths by getting them to the lane that night. Now, the evidence against Darren is the phone cell data which placed him in the area that night, and a similar van to his was actually seen leaving the lane that night. Now, whether you believe Darren's court testimony or even parts of it, that's up to you, but it's beyond argument that he could very well have been involved in the killings in many potential ways. Moving on to the next potential suspect, Steve Nipper Ellis. Steve was an ex-friend and associate of the three deceased, more so with Pat. He met Pat in prison and continued a friendship once they were both released, getting involved in various criminal activities together, ranging from robbing drug dealers to dodgy credit cards. But this friendship seemed to make Tucker jealous, and after a misunderstanding involving Nipper and a phone call to Tucker's girlfriend, Tucker went to Nipper's flat and threatened to cut his arm and foot off, which led to Nipper shooting Pat Tate, and then the firm threatening Nipper's family specifically to cut his younger sister's fingers off. So the motives were threat to life and threat to the family, mental torment, threats to cut off arm and foot, and potential motive was to finish off Pat Tate once and for all. Now, next on the suspect list is John Betts. Who was John Betts? He was the father of Leah Betts. And who was Leah Betts? She was unfortunate enough to die after taking an ecstasy tablet purchased at Raquel's, which was a nightclub based in Basildon, whose security was managed by Tony Tucker, who also effectively managed the drugs sold within the club. So in a nutshell, Tony Tucker was responsible in the eyes of the police, and I guess in the eyes of anybody else who cared, for the death of the young woman on her 18th birthday. This turned out being a very high profile death. While she was in a coma, the tabloid newspapers showed photographs of her in the hospital, on her hospital bed, on her deathbed effectively. And it was a high profile death, what happened. And John's motive to get revenge, John's motive is to get revenge for the death of his daughter, and that's reason enough to suspect him. But he may have also been encouraged or backed by Essex police to eliminate the dealers who sold the fatal tablet to his beloved daughter. Now, the evidence against John, so to say, is the fact that he was experienced in handling and shooting shotguns. The police claim to have arrested him, and he supposedly gave a valid alibi, and his shotgun were apparently checked and discounted as those used in the killings. But Essex police could very well have simply covered for the old friend and colleague, couldn't they? They can just say what they want to say, really, can't they? He could very easily have done this. Now, what was also suspicious was Dibley, Ivan Dibley, who was the lead investigator in the investigation of the triple murders. claimed that there was no link whatsoever between Leah Betts and the killings. So why was John Betts one of the first people to be arrested? I wonder if you could answer that question, Dibley. Anyway, moving on to the next suspect, Bernard O'Mahony. Now, you may have seen my undisclosed evidence videos regarding Bernard as a potential suspect, and there may be reason enough to believe that might be reasonable enough to believe it's him. But here is a list of potential motives regarding Bernard. Firstly, threats to life. Bernard had been threatened by the firm for cooperating with the police, and threats have been made towards not only Bernard but also his family. Another motive was the potential to take over the distribution of drugs in Raquel's, but also throughout Essex. The takeover of drugs in Raquel's alone would be worth potentially thousands a week. Bernard could well have wanted to take full control of security at Raquel's. Evidence against Bernard is the fact he's an ex-military and experienced in handling a range of firearms. He's had an obsession with the case from the very beginning and has pushed to make as much money as possible from the case since '95. But the other evidence is his own admissions regarding the case. Now, I will put a link in the description, and yeah, if you take a look at my undisclosed evidence videos, that will make a bit more sense. Next, a potential suspect is Dean Hegarty, or Mr. D, as he was referred to in court. Now, I will be making a separate video focused on who Dean was, but for this list, I have only information regarding potential motives and evidence. Now, Dean Hegarty was an alleged member of the Canyon Town cartel and had a history of violence. His first potential motive may have been after the theft of drugs. It's alleged by Billy Jasper that Dean killed the trio in revenge for them stealing consignment of drugs. The second potential motive is the theft of money from the Brinksmack gold robbery, which apparently some of these proceeds had been stolen by Tucker. Whether this is true or not, I do not know, but that is something that was alleged. A third potential motive was Leah Betts. It was made clear in Operation Tiberius, which was a leaked police document, that a crime lord, as a favour to a corrupt officer, offered to take out the people who sold the drugs to Leah Betts. And we know that was Tucker. So this could potentially have been Mr. D. Another potential motive was the theft of drugs from the Range Rover that night. Billy Jasper also alleges that Dean stole 3 kilos of cocaine from the Range Rover that night. Now, the potential evidence against Dean is the fact that he's an ex-military marksman who is experienced in killing and also handling a range of different firearms. Now, the next potential suspect is Mick Bowman, aka Mad Mick, who was a friend and associate of the 3 dead men. Now, Mad Mick was brought in for interview by police soon after the killings, and we know that Pat Tate made a phone call to Mick around an hour before the alleged time of death. We also know that Tony, Pat and Craig were intending on stealing a consignment of drugs, which they thought was due to land in a field in South Essex, and that 3 kilos of cocaine were Mick Bowman was going to help them cut 3 kilos of cocaine into 10 kilos of impure to give back to Michael Steele, who was the instigator of this whole job as such. Now, were Mad Mick and his own associates planning to steal the entire consignment? This is a potential motive. Another possible motive, however unlikely, was that Mick killed the trio out of pure dislike and hatred. He sort of went out of his way to mention in his police interview that the 3 men showed their true colours when he witnessed Sarah Saunders being kicked out of the bungalow. that she shared with Pat Tate. It could have been a motive of passion. Another possibility is the fear of a double cross regarding the supposed inbound drugs. Mick may have been highly paranoid that the trio were going to turn on him, so found the opportunity to get in there first. The evidence against Mad Mick Bowman starts with, as mentioned, phone records showing a call made from Pat Tate's mobile to Mick around an hour before the alleged time of death. Secondly, his refusal to answer certain questions at the end of his police interview is suspicious. And finally, his previous firearms offences and ability to handle guns falls as a potential piece of evidence against Mad Mick Bowman. The next potential suspects are the bent coppers, DC Philip Stimson and DC Wolfgang Bird, better known as Officer A and Officer B in court. Who are Bird and Stimson? Bird was a bent police officer associated with Darren Nicholls, who was actually convicted of offences unknown and discharged from the police force a short while after the trial of Holmes and Steele. Bird, we do know, was involved in criminal activities with Darren Nicholls and had even made plans to rob Michael Steele's car while it contained money or drugs. We know he received at least one dodgy handout of cash from Nicholls as a favour for obtaining reward money for Nicholls, who had stitched up innocent members of the public and accused them of drug dealing. DC Philip Stimson was another bent police officer connected to Darren Nicholls, who was himself convicted of offences and kicked out of the force. What's extremely irritating is the fact that both officers had court hearings against them held behind closed doors, and the public were never informed of the offences that they commit or the punishments handed down. Both men have identical potential motives, which are as follows: encouragement from higher end of police force to take out the firm, potential promotion, the potential to steal drugs, the potential motive of stealing drug money, killing the three men because they were having a negative effect or making it harder for them to carry out corrupt activities. For example, please, Nicholls saying we can't do X, Y and Z because, Nicholls could have been saying, we can't do X, Y and Z because Pat and the boys are making things on top. Also the Lear Betts issue. We know that both men had experience in handling shotguns. Now, moving on to the next potential suspect, Billy Blundell. Who was Billy Blundell? Billy was a South London gangster who had moved to Essex in the mid-80s and lived here ever since. Lived here until his death. He was a well-respected villain and notable gangster who knew, or certainly knew, of Pat, Tony and Craig. And he claims that a meeting had been called shortly before the murders where all three men were invited to meet with Blundell to sort of explain themselves for recent goings on and to basically be warned and told, what's what. Now, we do know that only one of the three men actually showed up. That was Pat Tate. And we are told that he was informed that he and the other two men had been acting out of control and that they were warned that if they carry on acting the way that they are acting, that they will end up, quote, having someone sneak up behind them and go bang in the back of the cobblers, unquote. Billy had the following potential motives. To begin with, this could easily have been an act of passion, purely the fact of Pat Tate disrespecting him, because his response, according to Billy, was, well, if it happens, it happens. And that is his response to Billy referring to him being shot. And he basically shrugged his warning off. So yes, this could easily be an act of passion regarding disrespect. Secondly, it could have been for control of drug distribution. Another possibility is that the killings were carried out as a favour for a crime syndicate. Another possibility for an act of passion could be the act of stopping the three men who are basically making things on top with their antics, including the Happy Eater, which was a restaurant which Pat robbed, the Pizza House incident where Pat robbed the local pizza restaurant when the manager refused to serve Pat different toppings on each quarter of his pizza. Tony and Craig murdered Kevin Whitaker, and of course the Leah Betts situation. Now, the only real evidence against Billy is the fact that he was an associate of a huge range of criminals who were effectively experienced in handling a variety of different firearms. Now, the final suspect or suspects, last but not least, Essex Police. Essex Police as a force. Not, of course, in its entirety, but a number of officers from a range of departments could well have pulled this off, and they have always been, in my eyes, very much, potential suspects, forgetting the fact that the entire investigation was almost, bodged. I do strongly believe that Essex Police could well have been to blame. So let's take a look at potential motives. To begin with, simply to take out 3 loudmouth drug dealers who were causing a vast amount of havoc wherever they went. Next, it could have been very well been justification for the Leah Betts. Who else to do the favour for good old John Betts that is, than his ex-colleagues and friends. Another possibility I've always gone with is that Essex Police and customs officers were sick and tired of being constantly outwitted by Michael Steele. Now, I know he was more loathed by customs officers than any other, but the favour could well have been called in. Another possible motive was to put an end to Pat Tate once and for all. Now, we do know, let's say, that I allege that the lead investigator in this case, Mr. Ivan Dibley, had a personal vendetta with Tate. In one of the Essex Boys documents, Dibley speaks of an encounter with Pat where Dibley went to visit Pat Tate in prison, unannounced, to try and get Pat Tate to admit to a number of armed robberies, which of course he did not, and this could well have been a motive. Another motive, and a simple one, is to remove dealers and an element of drug dealing from Essex. We know that the police believe that Tucker was the one who controlled the drugs which were supplied to Leah Betts, and we know that the police were also under pressure from the public to crack down on drug dealing in Essex. So what better way to clamp down on the dealers than to eliminate them altogether? It's also a possibility, as mentioned earlier, that the top end of the force could have commanded or given permission for the 2 bent coppers, Bird and Simpson, to carry out the killings. And what evidence is there against Essex Police? Well, the fact that they were in control of the crime scene, all the evidence, all the statements, all the interviews, all the documents, means that they could very well have carried out the killings and got away with it to this day. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I'm wishing everyone, like I said, a great 2022. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.